Well, hello everyone, and thank you, Sam. Thank you, Binta, and all the grad students for having first put together this amazing conference in a blitz at a time of confinement with all the disruptions induced by COVID. So this is really fantastic, and I want to first congratulate you on this initiative and your resilience and relentless effort to make it happen. So today I'm really pleased to introduce this panel, Politics of Memorialization, Remembering and Critiquing the Archive, which is really a nice follow-up from the fantastic keynote by Professor Aaron Dekar on sexuality, historiography, and geopolitics. So we can see the intersections on the discussions of the archives that is very pertinent to this panel, as it focuses on two wonderful presentations that are so insightful in remapping, interrogating politics of memorialization, remembering, and critiquing the archive in two different sites. So our first speaker will be Taiwo Bello, and Taiwo is a fourth-year doctoral candidate in African history at the University of Toronto. His dissertation titled Violence, Trauma, and Post-War Reconstruction, Gender, Memory, and the Nigerian Civil War, 1966-1970, examines the gendered recollection of the Civil War with specific focus on African women's roles and experiences in the conflict. Taiwo is widely published, and his work has been featured in numerous journals, scholarly outlets, cutting across military, gender, and humanitarian history in Africa. I also need to add that Taiwo is also a Vanier scholar, so congratulations, Taiwo. His paper is titled Supporting War Efforts, Women, Violence, and Agency in the Nigeria-Biafra War. And following Taiwo's presentation, we also have the absolute pleasure of welcoming here M.A. Murphy. M.A., are you here? Who will be our second speaker in this panel.
I'm here. Sorry.
Okay. Are you on? Are you on video? Excellent. So M.A. is going to be our second speaker on paper on reinvisioning the Visionaries, a critical pedagogy of place, settler implication, and mode of selected remembrance, and Erasure in Papaschase, Cree land, the University of Alberta campus. So M.A. Murphy is the second generation Irish settler and graduate student in the Gender and Social Justice program at the University of Alberta in Amishkawishinihan, Edmonton, on traditional Cree, Blackfoot, Dene, Nakota, Sioux, Saulteaux, and Métis Nation territory. She recently completed her BA in Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice Studies with a minor in First Nations and Indigenous Studies on unceded Coast Salish territories of UBC. Her interests include settler responsibility, Indigenous settler relations, transformative justice, and intersectional feminist art as practice, to name a few. She loves building community, being gentle, and challenging dominant power structures. So her paper, again, she will be following on Taiwo's presentation, Re-envisioning the Visionaries, a critical pedagogy of place, settler implication, and mode of selected remembrance and erasures on Papaschase, Cree land, University of Alberta. Please, again, we're virtual, but let's still give a warm welcome to our two panelists as they talk about their exciting work. Okay, Taiwo.
Okay, first I want to greet everyone. And I also appreciate the fact that I was invited to make a presentation. This is actually a chapter in my dissertation. So as Professor Lowe mentioned earlier, the title of my presentation is Supporting War Effort, Women, Violence, and Agency in the Nigeria-Biafra War. I want to believe that many of us here already have heard about the war, but the war itself, just to reiterate, the Nigeria-Biafra War was a war fought between the Nigerian government and a particular ethnic group called the Igbo ethnic group, which later became known as Biafra, between 1967 and 1970. But my interest here is not to talk entirely about the happenings during the war, but to look specifically at the roles of women in that war. And why am I interested in this? My interest in this arose from the fact that the voices of women during the war have been marginalized in the existing literature. First of all, the war happened. The war ended in 1970, but nothing was written on the women's roles and experiences in the conflict until 1997. And the author, called Annette Seaver, who wrote about the war, actually made a claim that women did not participate in combat activities during the war. That combat was an exclusive space of men. That women were not given the opportunity because women, according to Igbo culture, were actually supposed to cheer their men up. So when I saw that, I was amazed that, you know, even in 1997, we still did not have enough data to talk about the roles that women played in this war. Could it be that the women folded their arms and they were just watching events pass them by? They were watching their children die in the conflict. They were watching their husbands, their parents die in the conflict without doing anything. That then piqued my interest in this area. And since then, there haven't been much work done on this. The only major work, monograph on the roles and experiences of women in that conflict, was the work written by a particular scholar named Egodi Uchendu. And the title of that book is Women and Conflict in the Nigerian Civil War. But one thing that work did not focus on was the roles of women in the Biafra Heartland. She only focused on women in Anioma area, which happened to be a periphery area to Biafra, where the war took place as a whole. So my work now, my presentation will focus on the roles and the agency of women in the Biafra Heartland between 1967 and 1970. And the very first one I found during my research, and also during while having discussions with the majority of the people that experienced the war, that women indeed played key roles in the conflict. In short, the Biafran soldiers would not have survived in the war, would not have been able to fight between 1967 and 1970 when the war ended without the support that the women in Biafra rendered to them. And this first includes the supplies of food, for instance. The Biafran women were the ones who supplied virtually all the food that the Biafran soldiers who were on the war theater fighting against the Nigerian soldiers ate throughout the war. And just to provide an evidence to back this up, in 1968, the Biafran general by the name Odumegwu Ojukwu, Ojukwu was the key man in the conflict. He was the general. He was the one who directed all the war effort. He was like the Biafran governor at the time. So Ojukwu stated at the conference of the Biafran Union in Britain in 1968. This is his quote. He said, "Our entire armed forces are not being fed by the government. They are being fed by our women." But when this very author or some of the authors that have written about the roles of women or gender in the Nigeria-Biafra war would write anything, they would not refer to this. But here is the Biafran general testifying to the fact that their soldiers would not have survived in the conflict without the support that the women in Biafra or within the Biafra heartland actually rendered to them. This is just one of the various roles and activities or ways in which the women express their agencies during the conflict. And in terms of protest as well, the Biafran women between 1967 and 1970, they engaged in several protests, just registering their dissatisfaction about what was going on during the war, because their husbands were being killed, their children were dying of hunger and starvation, they were being bombed by the Nigerian soldiers and the like. So as a result, the women did not just keep quiet. They launched a series of protests all across Biafra, and also they wrote petitions to the Queen of England, just registering their dissatisfaction, stating that, look, the arms and ammunition that your government is supplying to the Nigerian government is being used to kill our people back in Biafra. You have to do something. If you don't do something, then we will take law in our hands. To the extent that the Queen of England was moved by the series of petitions sent by these women to England, and the Queen of England then decided to visit Biafra in the course of the war. This was actually this is also like one of the key areas in which the women also played key roles. In terms of technology as well, the Biafran women also rendered technological support, which helped the Biafran soldiers to be able to withstand the Nigerian soldiers in the course of the war. For instance, one of the most deadly bombs produced during the war was produced with the support of the women that enlisted in the technological department in Biafra, and that very weapon was called that very weapon was called the Ojuku's bucket. This Ojuku's bucket was a bomb that was eventually used by the Biafran soldiers to kill, just at a goal, about 500 Nigerian soldiers during the time. So another ways in which the Biafran women also contributed to this was that the women played a very huge role in the sense that they were sent out as diplomats, as Biafran diplomats. They were sent to the United Kingdom, they were sent to the United States, they were sent to France, just to negotiate and help, to negotiate what is there for Biafra, just to ensure that Biafra gained recognition by some of these very powers. And that's not even all. Some of them were also sent to places like Gabon, Ivory Coast, and also South America, where Biafran children were flown out to receive medical treatment. And the women treated those children. They played roles in, such as nursing, caregiving, and other important areas. And also, women played key roles in terms of combat. Majority of these women, interviews showed that majority of them were caught by the Nigerian soldiers fighting on the war front, and some of them were even killed. But all of these things, we hardly find them in the existing literature. So in conclusion, my point is that the Biafran women did not only contribute food or the likes to for the sustenance of Biafran populace or civilian population, as well as Biafran soldiers, but their activities also helped in reducing the number of casualties recorded in the course of that conflict. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Taiwo. We'll get back to you with questions. Thank you so much. We're back to MA. Murphy, are you ready?
Yep. I'm just trying to start my video, but it just says the host has stopped it. But I could just get the PowerPoint. Oh, here we go. Sweet. Hello. Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for having me. Great talk, Taiwo. So I'm just going to get the PowerPoint. Host. Oh, I'm just wondering if the host could let me screen share, if possible. Oh, wait, here we go. Oh, cool. Okay. Desktop 1. Sweet. All right. Okay. Sorry, it's my first time trying to screen share. If it doesn't work, I'll just start with the talk here. Just try one more time. Let's see.
Yeah, usually when you open the document and then go to share screen, it should pop up.
Okay, cool.
Have your main document on your desktop and then do share screen.
Okay, let's see.
Your PowerPoint full screen on your desktop and then do
share. Okay, here we go.
There.
Oh, cool. Can people see it?
Okay, yes, we can see you now.
Okay, awesome, great. Cool, thank you for being patient. Sweet, so thank you for having me, everybody. I feel honored to be here today. So can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. You can
Perfect.
Go.
Okay, great. So first of all, I would like to acknowledge that this paper was researched and written on Treaty 6 territory. Specifically, the University of Alberta is on the ancestral lands of the Papaschase Cree. I believe that as a white settler, I must constantly be interrogating my daily normative encounters with settler colonialism and whiteness, and within power structures and institutions such as the university. And I just wanted to make a note, in order to make the 10 minutes, I had to edit quite a bit, so I hope that it's cohesive and that there's enough information here. So for this talk, I will be referencing a monument in the center of the U of A campus of two white men entitled the Visionaries. I recently moved from Vancouver to Edmonton, and as I traversed the campus daily, I became curious about why these two men were being so memorialized. I asked whose histories are being remembered and whose are being forgotten. So here's the monument of Rutherford, who introduced legislation for the U of A campus, and Tory, who was the university's first president. A map of River Lot 5, the land the university is built on, sits on Rutherford's lap. Chief Papaschase and his family lived around the lands near Fort Edmonton in what is now known as Alberta. In the late 1850s, the Papaschase community moved permanently to the area along the North Saskatchewan River, near where the university sits. In 1877, Chief Papaschase signed on to Treaty 6, which states that every member would be promised 128 acres of land. However, over time, it became clear that the colonial government was not going to keep many of its treaty promises. Also, settlers, most notably the racist Frank Oliver, petitioned the government to move the Papaschase Reserve 4 miles south of the river in order to make more space for settlement. So here's a map. You can see the river in the top left, and they were pushed down. You can see the grid closer to the bottom, and they eventually lost that entire parcel of land there. So in 1888, the Papaschase men lost their reserve in South Edmonton. The last bit of land that they controlled was annexed by the city between 1959 and 1982. Present-day Papaschase chief Calvin Bruno asserts that there has been no restitution, no compensation, and no acknowledgement from the federal government. Currently, Dwayne Donald, a Papaschase Cree professor at the University of Alberta, states that, quote, part of the tragedy of the Papaschase, apart from what happened to them materially and the violation of the treaty agreement, was also the very violent separation of Wakotowin, kinship sensibility, and their relations with the land. Just gonna, oh, here we go. There we go. Although they continue to face struggles towards gaining federal status and reestablishing treaty rights, modern-day Papaschase resistance remains strong. In 2018, the 1,200-member band was recognized by the Assembly of First Nations, which is an important step towards being recognized by the government and getting land back. So back to the statue. By the time Rutherford and Tory arrived in Edmonton, the Papaschase had been relocated from the river. Rutherford and Tory, both Scottish, came to Edmonton viewing the land as something that needed to be made productive. According to Ellen Schock, Rutherford and Tory, quote, saw River Lot 5 as a forest with a few cleared acres. This blank slate was just right for them, end quote. This language illuminates the way that the men perceive the land, as a blank slate, which implies emptiness, vastness, and the concept of terra nullius. Emptiness from the colonizer's perspective means underutilized, which means ripe for exploitation. Thinking critically about the monument, it is important to note that it is a 3-meter tall, 900-kilogram bronze monument situated in a very central location on campus with 24/7 lighting and seating. Both men are engaged with the map of River Lot 5, highlighting their roles as founders of the university as well as colonizers of indigenous lands. Here it is important to ask, how are memories institutionalized? Not only can the strategic institutionalization of colonial memory making be critiqued with the monument, but also with the wording on the plaque. The plaque states that, quote, the University of Alberta's first president was tasked with turning a plot of field and bush into a modern university. This statement implies that the plot of land was empty and that these two settlers must develop it. Also, the term modern university implies that the prior usages of the land were ancient, pre-modern, bygone, a typical settler ideology that places indigenous peoples and their practices as in the past. The second quote states that Torrey and Rutherford met to survey the vast open fields and visualize what was to become the university. This also upholds the notion that the land was vacant and available for the taking. The removal of the the removal of the Papaschase from their original lands by the river can be understood as part of a deployment of spatial practices and representations that have rendered indigenous territories unclaimed or underutilized, or in the case of terra nullius, empty wildernesses. Delaware and Cherokee professor Jay Johnson proclaims that the erasure or removal of meaning from places allows for the creation of an abstract space void of meaning. For places in the landscape, places with significant longer histories, with roles to play in the preservation of these histories, for these places to change into spaces and take on a resource role in the colonial and capitalist endeavor, then the longer history must be erased. Once void of its previous history, these newly empty spaces are ready to be filled with settlers. The longer histories created and maintained by indigenous historians were systematically erased by European colonialism, creating a tabula rasa, a blank landscape upon which a new story and history could be written. In order for River Lot 5 to eventually be colonially mapped and become available for sale, certain people and their connections to the land had to be written out of history. The plaque and monument worked to negate Papaschase people and their culture, creating the sense that the campus's history is the only history that matters. Young highlights that monuments have long sought to provide a naturalizing locus for memory, in which a state or institution's triumphs and martyrs, its ideals and founding myths are cast as naturally true as the landscape in which they stand. Interrogating colonial memory making can be practiced through the utilization of Jay Johnson's critical pedagogy of place, recognizing the various experiences of communities, peoples, and non-human creatures that share relationships with a place. Johnson's understanding is that this pedagogy can lead people towards reading places as political texts within indigenous peoples' daily struggles. According to DNA scholar Glenn Coulthard, place is a way of knowing, experiencing, and relating with the world. In many indigenous knowledge systems, places are not always named and not always justly named. They do not always appear on maps. They do not have agreed upon boundaries. They are not fixed. Places are not more readily understood by objective accounts. Finally, and most importantly, places have practices. In some definitions, places are practices. Relationality, place, and kinship profoundly influence many indigenous knowledges and ways of being, and can call colonial geography and memory making into question. Kwakwak scholar Sarah Hunt asks, in order to fundamentally challenge Western geographic hegemonies, how might geographic knowledge serve to facilitate decolonization or anti-colonial projects? Oh, just gonna go to the next slide. Here we go. By challenging Western geographic knowledges, it also becomes clear to see the ways in which colonial memory making can be understood as deeply political and cultural. Rothberg encourages us to remember that what matters is not memory and representation alone, but the consequences of their articulation and interpretation. Political and cultural memory are mediated and rely not only on libraries, museums, and monuments, but also on various modes of education. These memories are built on selection and exclusion, neatly separating useful from not useful and relevant from irrelevant. Where is a monument dedicated to Chief Papaschase on campus? A serious engagement and critique of these dominating colonial histories, memories, and narratives underscores the potential radical pedagogical authority of memory, in that it may make apparent the insufficiency of the present It's in our own incompleteness, the inadequacy of our experience, the requirement that we revise not only our own stories, but also the very presumptions that regulate their coherence and intelligibility. A critical reading of place can highlight that neither the monument nor its meaning is really everlasting. We might also remind ourselves that public memory is constructed, that understanding of events depends on memory's construction, and that there are worldly consequences in the kinds of historical understanding generated by monuments. Realizing that memory is constructed, a critical pedagogy of place can shift this monument's meaning towards a decolonial one where not only the Papaschase Cree's rich histories and contemporary realities are upheld, but also one where differently situated settlers can recognize their implication, as well as confront structures of power and supremacy on these lands. Although settlers on campus today, such as myself, are not complicit in a legal sense in crimes that happened before we were born, we still continue to benefit from structures of settler colonialism. We are implicated. Implicated subjects occupy positions aligned with power and privilege and contribute to, inhabit, inherit, benefit from regimes of domination. This means that settlers must become reflexive and responsible, embodying actions that embrace difference and build solidarity. Decolonial work cannot just remain theoretical, but must be connected to the place-based nature of ongoing colonialism in the lands and communities in which we live. Further, Tuck and Yang assert that the cultivation of critical consciousness, literature, and pedagogy is important, but unless there are material acts based around land, there is not an actuality of decolonization. Although, quote, the details are not fixed or agreed upon, decolonization in the settler colonial context must involve the repatriation of land simultaneously to the recognition of how land and relations to land have always already been differently understood and enacted. That is all of the land and not just symbolically. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, M.A. Murphy, for your paper. I think now we have time for a Q&A. I would like to say that both papers, although they deal with different geohistorical contexts, have many overlap. And in terms of, you know, the politics of the archive, the politics of memorialization, women in the context of Taiwo being written out of the National Archive and the national history within particular historical times. And for Murphy, you know, really the ever-present and hegemony of white settler colonialism and how it marks its imprints in sites like the university grounds. So I would like to refer now to our audience to see if they have any particular questions. And I think our two speakers will be more than happy to engage in a dialogue on their papers. If there's no particular questions coming from the audience, I have a question for both of you. What do you think are the research ethics involved in your respective projects? Taiwo or Murphy, I think, and the audience can raise hand or share their questions, so we have time for a couple of questions.
I can start, or oh no, if you're.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you so much for that question, Prof. Lo. In research like mine, which involves gender, which is a sensitive topic, violence and the like, I think the very first thing to do is to the very first thing that I tried to do was to try to pass through the ethics board of the University of Toronto. And one of the things proposed was that before any interview or research would be conducted in this society, even though the society is one that I am very familiar with because I grew up in that society, I would have to ensure that I gained the consent and the confidence of the people that I'm supposed to speak with. As a result, I developed some questionnaires ahead of time, to which I read to the people involved, the people who might have experienced issues such as trauma, violence, and some of them lost their children and their husbands and the likes. So I developed these, and I asked them ahead of time, would you like to participate in these? Just pre-interview kind of documents. And then the ones that indicated that they would love to participate. My research is still ongoing. My research has not been concluded yet, but most of the things that I talked about here, I found them in some other primary documents that I found in archives. In Canada here, the Presbyterian Church in Canada archives. I'm using that archive, and I'm also using the United States archives as well as the National Archives in Nigeria. So these are the things that I'm doing, but my interview has not started in full bloom. I'm still interviewing, and I'm still getting a sense of what the women experienced during the war, what their roles were, and the likes. So to come down to your question and to enter,
one
first
minute.
thing is to
One minute, yeah.
try.
Go
Yes,
ahead,
please.
Taiwo.
Yeah, so the first thing I did was to try get the consent of these people that actually experienced this war, because there's no way I would conduct interviews with them without seeking their consent. They have to be comfortable, and I would have to assure them that, look, these documents is going to be kept in privacy. It's not going to be exposed to other people that you might not want to see this. So these were some of the things that I mean, part of the ethics that I think one needs to follow when conducting such research.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Taiwo. And we know that the Biafra War, 50 years, has just been marked in 2020. And this is certainly very timely and insightful research that will certainly help correct some of the gaps and erasures in the archives when it comes to women's contribution and role, positions in the Biafra War. Thank you. And M.A. Murphy?
Yeah, for me, a lot of it is like, I just moved to these lands, so learning about Treaty 6 and responsibilities, and then really building community and following Indigenous leadership. So those are really important for me. And looking through the U of A archives where I did most of this research, I really wanted to find like Papaschase voice and their voices of resistance. And so I used they have a current website, so I got a lot of my information from there. And then a lot of interviews that the chief has done recently, because I didn't want to have, I wanted to have a resistance-focused approach and resilience, and then just building community and being really accountable, not just being like a parachute researcher and then leaving. So working on, now that I'm here and I've been here for a year, doing the work to be in community is really important for me.
Okay.
Yeah, ongoing, yeah.
Okay, it looks like you've thought about those broader question of ethical responsibility towards the communities and those that are still marked by these experiences and particular histories in your research. So I think that was where I was trying to kind of frame a little bit the conversation. But you have here two excellent questions. How do we address memorialization and monuments as a Western construct when it comes to honoring Indigenous histories? That's one. And the second question is, it would be interesting to think alongside consent and the archives, thinking alongside land defenders, youth leadership, pure, two-spirit frontline land defenders for ethical relationality. And I think the question of ethical responsibility is still here. And these two questions, I think, frame very nicely the contested, debate about memorialization, especially when it comes to occupied land and settler colonialism. So is there anything you would like to add to and address these two questions before we wrap up?
Well, it had me thinking, because even when I was reading my notes, one of my questions is like, where's the monument for Chief Papaschase on campus? And just thinking about how can we move beyond monuments and thinking about monuments, and how do we build the ongoing relationships that we need today on these lands. So it's just interesting to think about how just monuments are just, there's so much missing, and that it goes so far beyond that, and how to build those relationships and get people thinking about their implication. How can the monuments encourage implication and then responsibility, if at all, or do we just tear them all down? So it's just, it's big questions that I'm just still thinking and grappling with.
Excellent. Well, on those, and that note, I'd like to thank the audience, and most importantly, our panelists for their very insightful and generative presentations. So we are at the end of this panel time at 2. And thank you so much. And once again, congratulations to the WGSI grad students for having pulled together this amazing, fantastic, and so impactful conference. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. And to the audience, thanks for joining us. And I think I'll leave it to Sam and Binta to announce the next session. Congratulations. Bye. Now I have to go to Lynn's